Thank you very much for joining the Renaissance Society tonight for Oyster, A Global History with Carolyn, also known as Carrie Tillie. Carrie, this is the second talk that she has done for us. She's written a book, Oyster, A Global History. You can see the picture there. She'll talk more about it. You saw her last a couple weeks ago with the Feast for the Eyes. She's going to do another talk for us on April 14th. She is a freelance writer and also an award-winning artist. She's the author of this book and lives, you live in Montara, which you're going to have to talk about. She's going to introduce herself as well, so we'll find out more about her also when I do her questioning. So I'm turning it over to you now. Carrie, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen, and thank you all for joining me. I want to apologize up front if I don't cover part of the oyster lore or history that interests you. And I'll give you a little background about why I wrote this book and the threads that I'm going to take involve some of my personal interests, although they are expanded in the book, but about ancient history. And I'm a bit of an Anglophile, so part of how the rise of oyster in medieval Britain and into some of the artwork that that oysters get incorporated into. But for the global history, for the reaction press, when I introduced the book, and I apologize, I'm trying to get the slide to go to the next slide. In the mid-1970s, I was a 12-year-old and I was taken to New Orleans by my father, who had 5 sisters, one of whom, Aunt Lola, was a Playboy bunny. And she was, I don't know if she's in this picture, but she worked in the heart of the French Quarter in New Orleans at that first club. I think the first club was in Chicago. That was a temple of female pulchritude. And I remember flipping through her scrapbook of pictures of memorabilia. She hung out with Bob Hope and Omar Sharif. And what I didn't understand at the time as a 12-year-old, but comprehended later, like the fictional Auntie Mame, Aunt Lola was a woman full of vitality and energy and a joie de vivre that I found incredibly compelling. During the 1960s, the New Orleans Playboy Club, which was a converted carriage house, sat on Iberville Street, and that's the same block as Felix Oyster Bar and the Acme Oyster House. What I didn't know then, but I understand now, is how this confluence of food and sex established a vortex in which my Aunt Lola thrived. On our first night, as a 12-year-old, she took us to Antoine's, which was still one of the oldest restaurants in America. And she winked at me because she said, "Oh, I know some people." And ordering an oyster appetizer platter for the table, we all started to share while we were looking at the menu to figure out what we were going to eat that evening. What I saw come in front of me was this platter of oysters Rockefeller and oysters Thermidor and oysters on the half shell. And this was my introduction to oysters. So I copied my Aunt Lola as she drizzled a little mignonette on the glistening grayness and taught me how to scoop it into my mouth and taste with gusto. In her mid 50s late 40s, early 50s, she still garnered a lot of attention from everyone in the room. And what my 12-year-old brain didn't know, that this was just sex appeal. So the joy of my gastronomic discovery that evening was that instead of ordering another entree, my dad let me go ahead and order more oysters for my main meal. I idolized my aunt. I wanted to be just like her. And my transmutation could only occur by the ingestion of the magical bivalve. The biology of an oyster, and I'm going to apologize because I'm not a scientist. So I struggle with some of the minutia of how oysters work, but they're a simple looking creature with a very complex lifestyle. Generally, they start off male and settle into femaleness later on. They can change their gender and are considered protandrous, first male hermaphrodites. Some genera, like the Ostrea edulus, the common European oyster, will flip back and forth throughout their whole lifestyles. And while they appear to be a singularly simple gray blob, they actually have a heart and lungs and kidneys and colorless blood. Yet with no brain, it is a marvel of engineering because they operate as a filter and they can help clean the body of waters in which they live. There's different types of ways that oysters are grown. Currently, there is bottom growing oysters versus off bottom. And the picture here is from Willapa Bay, Washington, where they are initially brought from a hatchery when they're like 3-week-old larvae, and they're set onto a mother shell or a culch. These young oysters will grow in clusters to an adult harvestable size and then be laid on the bottom where they're scooped up by that boat that you see. What's become much more extensive is considered off-bottom cultivation. And there's multiple different ways. The rack and bag, where they're grown in mesh bags attached to metal racks, suspended in nets or trays. They change the way that they are end up tasting. So the rack and bag oysters, for example, result in thinner shell oysters. These are like the Hog Island at Tamales Bay. Suspended oysters also have a thin shell. It's an interesting dynamic, and I will confess to not having that encyclopedic knowledge of which oyster does which. What we're currently eating when you go to a restaurant now are what I term the big five. And there are currently over 300 named oysters throughout the world. So if you think of the cushy or the PEI or the Fanny Bay, these are all different genera and species. The European flat on the far left, the Ostrea edulus, is kind of dying out, and that is one of my personal obsessions. They are the Bellin oyster, or what was the Colchester flat. The Atlantic, what we would know from the Atlantic Ocean, like the Wellfleet or the Blue Point. The Pacific oyster is kind of the granddaddy of the world at this point, the Fanny Bay and the Miyagi's. And the Pacific oyster is the one that is being reseeded throughout the world because it's a little hardier. The Kumamotos, also known as kumis, are very small and sweet. And then the Olympians, which are mostly preside up near Washington and Oregon in the Pacific Northwest. Besides these big five, there are others that are out there being eaten. Mary Ellen mentioned earlier about Hemingway, and in his Movable Feast in Paris, he wrote about closing up his notebook and putting it in his pocket, asking the waiter for a dozen Portugueses, which would have referred to the Portuguese oyster, and half a carafe of dry white wine. Now, this Portuguese oyster is almost extinct, and it's been killed out by a disease, and I'm going to butcher this, maladie de branchies, or a gill necrosis. But there are some farmeries that are trying to bring back the Portuguese. You can see the genera and the species. The big five that I mentioned are kind of in the center of this grid, but I wanted to also point out the sumo, which is a monster bred to be huge. the Chilean or the bluff oyster, which is found in South America, and the Sydney rock oyster, or the Scustrius glomerata. And at one point, excuse me, when the Dutch Indies were exploring the world and they went and quote unquote discovered Australia, this oyster was the size of a plate. It could have been over 10 inches long during the 1500s, 1600s. The oldest evidence of mass oyster consumption dates back 164,000 years to Mossel Bay in South Africa, which is now known as the point of human origins. The largest middens in the world are found there. And I must say, semi-adjacent to that, the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, arguably the oldest living culture on Earth, have archaeological middens also ascribed to them, which are 40 and 60,000 years old. The Ngaro Aborigines, who inhabited the Whitsunday Islands and coastal region of Queensland from about 7000 BC to the resettlement in 1800s, are associated with these cave paintings. And these are some of the oldest art that has been depicted of oysters that were found. Because there were no evidence of other mammal bones in the excavations, it can be asserted that the oysters were their main source of protein. We know that oysters are one of the oldest beings on the earth, and some of these go back to Paleolithic times. The thickness of the shell on the left, and this is an oyster that I own, this is from the Jurassic period, would have been protected from predators such as crabs and snails. There'd be decapods and gastropods. The overall shape of the Gryphaeid oyster on the right was a consequence of living on soft, fine-grained substrates. Now, fossils of this Gryphaeid oyster started to come up during the medieval times in England, and I own a couple of these, and they were known as the devil's toenails because of their shape. They were so frightening. The highly coyed Gryphaeid oysters were free living. They didn't necessarily live on a substrate, and their shape appears to be the result of repeated downward toppling into the mud. So they're fascinating when they're found, but they were not necessarily edible the way the one on the left would have been. So I'm going to jump to ancient Greece, where gastronomically oysters began to appear in some of the earliest cookbooks. For the Greeks, it would have been the 3rd century, and I'm going to butcher this, Dapnosophiste. My Greek is horrible. As well as the Roman cookbook Apicius, which was compiled in the 4th and 5th century, but attributed to the gourmet who lived in the 1st century. Now, the speculation is tied that the Greeks may be tied with the Chinese for being the first to cultivate the oyster. The Greek fishermen would have seen that the baby oysters would attach themselves to pieces of pottery that would be discarded in the waters. And since they wanted to make it easier to get the adult oysters later, the shards would have been attached to be more accessible to the local coastline. Now, the oyster would have found an acceptable substrate, or culch, as it's called, the pottery shard. And the baby oysters, also known as spat, were then moved to regions called bedding that would give them a space to grow. On the right is a pottery shard known as an ostracon. And the word ostracize, now meaning to exclude, is of Greek origin and is related to the oyster, because in ancient Greece, there would be a popular yearly vote of citizens to banish, usually someone that was unpopular, or it might be who gained too much power. These votes took place by carving that person's name on a pottery shard known as an ostracon, which usually had an oyster-like shape. Jumping over to Rome, Pliny the Elder wrote in his natural history of Sergius Orata, who is reputed to be the first man to have invented oyster ponds on the Gulf of Baiae. This was during the time of the orator Lucretius Crassus, around the Marsic Wars. And what Orata had done was incredibly innovative. The Romans were starting to import oysters, and Orata figured out how to create an artificial oyster bed in Lucrine Lake in Campania with the construction of dams and channels that would protect the oysters from ocean tides. He worked out new breeding techniques by placing twigs around the mature spawning oysters in order to catch the new spat that would be floating about. He transported those babies to these newly created oyster beds. The Roman civil engineer and author Vitruvius credits Orata with the invention of the hypocaust, or this underfloor heating, which enabled Orata to keep the oysters from dying during cold winters. Now, there's some debate whether Orata really was the inventor, but it is known that he constructed the large suspended water basin under which existed a fireplace, and this ductwork system used pipes to bring in the warm water to the oyster beds to keep them from freezing. This invention was quickly repurposed into oyster baths or all over the Roman Empire. And what I love about the Romans and their love of oysters is sort of this documentation. This bottle, which exists at the Corning Museum, is a fully incised, etched, it's polished with cut incisions in the diagrams, which depicts the construction of pylons from which ropes dangle with full sacks of oysters, and that explanatory word, ostriaria. This verifies the aqua farming techniques, and it's easy to see the mechanisms by which the oysters were then could be cleaned and sorted and culled. Now, to give an example of Romans' love of oysters, I'll give you my big three. Emperor Tiberius, before he was an emperor, when he was managing the armies for Augustus, is reputed to have feasted on and sustained his troops for several months with the oysters found in the Bay of Molistan, which is now modern-day Croatia. At the time, it was the Roman province of Illyricum. Apicius is said to have figured out a way to pack fresh oysters for transport, and he sent the much-loved shellfish to Emperor Trajan during the Mesopotamian campaign of AD 115. Even then, the oyster was a food of excess, with reports of Seneca consuming 1,000 oysters a week, and the Roman Emperor Vitellius, again, eating 1,000 oysters in one sitting. We know about some of these transports because we've talked about middens. They have been found in Germany, and they've been found along Hadrian's Wall. Wherever there were Roman troops, they have found oyster middens. Now, Claudius, circa 40 AD, led a campaign which resulted in the first permanent legionary fortress to be built in Britain, which is my other obsession. I'm a bit of an Anglophile. He went into what was then known as Camulodonium, which is modern day Colchester in the county of Essex. This is the oldest town in Britain, and it was known for the Colne estuary. Oysters from Colne and the nearby Mercia Islands have been an important food source throughout much of Colchester's history. And it's my way of segueing into the Middle Ages and into the medieval times. These large dumps, again, more middens of oyster shells, have been found at Balkern Hill, which is from the Roman period. The borough of Colchester obtained the rights to the fishery under the provisions of its royal charter, granted by Richard I in 1189. And the oysters obtained from the fishery were known as Colchester natives. And again, you can see that large flat shell. During the Middle Ages, the Domesday Book was written, and it was ordered 20 years after the Battle of Hastings of 1066 by Harold's successor, William the Conqueror. The book's purpose was to categorize the country's holdings for tax purposes and to prepare the military against the threat of the Danish invasion of 1085. But it's an invaluable resource for historians for the breadth of information provided on the distribution of landed property, such as the county of Essex and the estuary where the oysters were held. For the first time since Apicius, oysters began appearing in a cookbook in the form of curry, written in 1390, written for the master chefs of Richard II. The medieval cookbook presents oysters in both sweet and savory recipes, such as boiling shucked oysters in wine and in their own liquor, then adding either sugar or spices or onions and herbs. Keep in mind that sugar was so rare, there wasn't a differentiation between a savory course and a sweet course being for dessert. They would eat sugar throughout the entire meal. But the demand for oysters revived a long dormant trade between the coasts and the inland cities as transportation of oysters began anew. Inland residents received their shipments in barrels of seawater, allowing the oysters to stay alive for 2 to 3 weeks. And by looking at the form of curry, we can speculate how the general populace of Britain would have cooked their oysters. Ample documentation suggested the kings still favored them raw. Henry IV was known for regularly downing 400 in one sitting as a precursor to his main meal. But what fascinated me was the discovery in 2014 of Richard III's final resting place under the car park in Leicester. An unprecedented scientific analysis of a monarch's remains have shown levels of isotopes of oxygen, strontium, nitrogen, and carbon. A lot of this indicates that Richard had a very rich diet, which would have included peacocks and herons, but lots and lots of oysters. This is much attributed to the practice of religious observances requiring meat-free diet for up to 1/3 of the year. And I love that picture. As we jump towards the Renaissance, I'm going to take you to oysters as an art form. Now, they made a grand entrance into the visual arts during the 15th century, most prevalently in Flemish still life paintings. But here, this oyster is displayed in proximity to a woman. When you see a painting, if the oysters are closed, it would denote that the virtue of the woman is still intact, or that she would still be a virgin. If opened, it alludes to the libidinous behavior, such as this woman in Jan Bruegel's The Senses, taste, hearing, and touch. You can see the female figure is sitting alone at the table on the right with this bounteous feast of oysters, fruit, wine, crayfish, and quail. Her exposed bosom near the opened oysters alludes to an ecstatic wanton state. That she herself is plunging a fork into an oyster implies that she is the sexual instigator. In Jan Steen's Girls Eating Oysters, I want you to look into this girl's eyes. It's a come hither look. And if you look down at her fingers, and I did a close-up of this, she's sprinkling salt on the oyster, which would be really odd for us. But during the era, salt was also considered an aphrodisiac. The glass of wine and possibly a bed behind her indicates her intentions, as well as her direct glaze. She is offering the oysters and she's offering herself. Her outfit is made of warm, plushy materials, delicate white mink and crimson velvet, and that's worn by the wealthy. She was not an inexpensive prostitute, if that's what she is. The Delft pitcher and the glass of golden liquid, those are all expensive items. So we don't know what the people outside the door are, if they're waiting for her or if they're preparing food, but she's in very wealthy surroundings. So both of these paintings allude to oysters as an aphrodisiac. And historically, a food's influence would be associated with what it resembled. The example was the walnut was believed to strengthen the brain because it looked like a human brain, or a banana could cure male impotence because of its phallic shape. Well, mollusk shells, and particularly oyster shells, have been found by archaeologists in sites that are associated with procreation and are symbolic of the womb and birth and rebirth. According to Hesiod's theogony, the nymph of love was created when Cronus surgically removed Uranus's genitals and threw them in the sea. Thus, foam was created from which Aphrodite appeared. The Greek word aphros, from which her name derives, means sea foam, and it is from this association that we get the word aphrodisiac, arousing sexual desire. Scientifically, oysters are rich in zinc, and zinc plays an important role in wound healing and immunity, but it is also known to aid male virility. The prostate needs 10 times more zinc than any other organ, secreting 1 to 3 milligrams per ejaculation. So there is some scientific evidence that oysters might actually be an aphrodisiac. They also contain dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that assists the brain in the governance and activity of sexual desire. So I will leave it at that, but we'll introduce you to some well-known libertines throughout history. And these are anecdotal in some ways. Casanova was said to have started each day with a breakfast of 50 oysters, quote, off the breasts of a beautiful woman, usually in a warm bathtub. King Louis had them shipped daily only from the beds at Consol in France. And Honoré de Balzac would start a meal with 5 dozen. Now, these are all men. And so I want to introduce you to Napoleon's sister, Pauline. Now, many of Napoleon's enemies claimed that the little general would have eaten oysters before a battle. And that may explain why both Danton and Robespierre were thought to have consumed several dozen when their ideologies failed them. But Napoleon's sister, when she returned to Europe from exile in Santo Domingo, came with a handful of African slaves whose sole duty was to do nothing but her bidding. Notable among them was a particularly well-endowed man whose daily task was to carry Pauline to her morning bath and feed her a breakfast of fresh oysters and champagne. We can only speculate what his other services might have been besides oyster shucking and food service. Continuing the idea of oysters and sex, I'm going to jump towards Charles Dickens and brothels. And in many ways, brothels and oyster houses hearkening back to my Playboy Club and Aunt Lola, go hand in hand. They contribute to the affiliation of oysters and sex. The first red light district dates back to the 14th century Amsterdam, mostly catering to sailors, continuing the sex and seafood concept. But 19th century New York's red light district was in the Bowery, and the place to dine upon oysters was in cellar restaurants, often situated underneath or next to brothels. In his 1842 American Notes, Dickens commented upon the plethora of sketchy dance halls and the oyster restaurants, which were located semi-underground, which had to be marked with red lights, hence the red light district. He wrote, quote, "These signs, which are so plentiful in shape like river buoys or small balloons hoisted by cords to poles and dangling there, announce, as you may see by looking up, quote, oysters in every style. They tempt the hungry most at night, for then dull candles glimmering inside illuminate these dainty words and make the mouths of idlers water as they read and linger." Of course, oysters in every style is a double entendre. They were not only announcing the type of oyster that was being offered, but the services of the ladies within. Since we are now in the New World, I'll backtrack a little bit and we'll mention Mark Kurlansky's book. Most people have heard of it. It was a New York Times bestseller, and it is a great survey on how oysters came to America. And I'm not going to touch on that too much because it's so expansive in his book. In short, in 1609, the Dutch sailed into America's upper New York Bay and discovered what was at that time half of the world's supply of oysters. Just below the Hudson River were 360 square miles of oyster beds. These newly arriving Dutch immigrants would name the two islands in New York Harbor where oysters could be had, Great Oyster Island and Little Oyster Island, which would then become Liberty Island and Ellis Island. The Dutch learned from the Lenape Indians how to go out in skiffs and use tongs, which are these rakes, to dig the oysters up off of the bottom of the seabed. Most Europeans had oyster beds that they could walk out into and gather them by hand. As America grew, so did its industry. And Samuel Pepys, the British diarist who was writing in the 1600s, told us of the availability of oysters via street vendors in London. But the newly transported European settlers were accustomed to this easy accessibility. So the tradition continued in the Americas, and specifically in New York, where the oysters were not as physically easy to obtain. Since the shallow estuaries of New England, when the tide went out, you could go and pick them up pretty easily. But this was a similar practice to the one the Europeans had known in England and France and Netherlands, where stalls would be set up and you could get your oysters shucked fresh or have them cooked, or you could take them home where a housekeeper or your wife could make them into a stew. I think Mary Ellen mentioned this. These relatively nondescript stoneware jars have a very important place in the history of the oyster industry, especially in America. Used to hold oysters and sold to ship captains to transport oysters to the West Indies. These particular jars were made by an African-American potter named Thomas Comerall. Pickling and exporting to the West Indies began around 1700. And this is when oysters began to be transported. These particular jars were made about 1803 to 1805. And excuse me, when Thomas Jefferson was president, and slavery was still alive and well in New York. At the time, a Black oysterman named Daniel Johnson, whose name is on the center jar, was one of the most prominent oystermen of his time. Now, many of the most well-reputed oystermen during the era were African Americans, and I think a whole book could be written just on that topic alone. Thomas Jefferson was also responsible for another much desired oyster treat of that era. In the late 1700s, Jefferson sampled ice cream in Paris, and he brought the recipe home, built an ice house at Monticello, and then one at the White House when he became president. On Independence Day in 1806, Jefferson tasked a servant with making ice cream, starting the summertime tradition that probably earned his reputation for bringing it to America. But at that time, unlike our penchant for sweet ice cream today, they would have made oyster ice cream, and it was a huge, huge hit. George Washington was also an oyster lover, and his cash accounts at Mount Vernon document the purchase of many bushels and barrels. And my favorite anecdote of our forefathers and their love of oysters goes to Ben Franklin. He illustrated the general difficulty of traveling great distances by horse on muddy roads during poor weather. After many hours of harsh riding, Franklin arrived at the Rhode Island Inn. Hopeful of rest and warmth by fire, he saw too many other travelers with the same idea, and there was no place to sit. He called loudly to a servant, "Boy, take a quart of oysters out to my horse." Incredulous that a horse would eat and enjoy oysters, many of the other travelers followed the boy to witness the spectacle, thereby freeing up the space by the fireplace for the weary Franklin. No account has been given on what the horse thought of the oysters. The expansion of the oyster industry in Americas have many, many factors. During the 1800s, we started to see waterborne commerce as paddle boats were going up and down the Mississippi River. There was the establishment of the canning industry, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad between 1840 and 1860, the California Gold Rush of 1849, and most importantly, I think the unprecedented immigration of a European workforce, which streamed through Ellis Island. Many of these came from countries that already had a great love of oysters. The Dalmatians coming from Croatia, the Italians, it's a little unprecedented. But the growth of love of oysters was such that we would start to have advertising. And these sort of Victorian trade cards were an early form and a very collectible form of advertising. Popularized after the Civil War by businesses, they offer a colorful and diverse look at the popular culture and society of the late 1800s. With the advent of lithography in the 1870s, it made possible to mass produce them in color. And it kind of led to a golden age from 1876 to the early 1900s, when newspapers and magazines became more prevalent. Now, I mentioned, excuse me, the Dalmatians, because we started having the growth of the restaurant industry. I already mentioned Antoine's, which was dated from 1840. The Boston Union Oyster House, which is still the oldest restaurant in the country, has been shucking and serving since 1826. And California's Tadich Grill, which was opened by Dalmatians. So the oyster restaurants and taverns were opening all over America. And the two other restaurants that are still in service are Antoine's, excuse me, which was made famous for its oysters Rockefellers. Tadich was known for its Hangtown fry, and there are some ideas about the origins of the Hangtown fry. And I'm sorry, I'm looking at my time and I'm at 40 minutes, so I'm going to run through some disparity in the class that the canning industry was mostly done by children. This picture of 7-year-old Rosie, who couldn't read, would have worked a good 7 hours a day, when some of these kids would have gone to school for 4 hours and then worked for 7 and come back and shucked afterwards. Mothers would bring their children in for shucking and canning. The picture on the left was there's a quote that says, "All of these children except babies shuck oysters, and 10 babies at the Pass packing plant." The man who wrote it said, "I saw them all at work long before daybreak. This photo was taken at noon in the absence of the superintendent, who refused me permission because of the child labor agitation." The mothers would bring their children in, and the warehouses were frigid, so the death toll was uncounted. They would average about 65 quarts a day, and at 2.5 cents a quart, the families could earn about $9 a week. The flip side of this during this was the Belle Epoque and the Golden Age of Oysters. While the poor were consuming their oysters with brown bread and beer, the elite were relishing their oysters with caviar and champagne at places like Delmonico's. Charles Ranoffer's book, The Epicurean, has no fewer than 30 oyster recipes, from Viennese to stuffed to fried to Indian style. And for these multi-hour meals, which started with raw oysters, there would be, you wouldn't want to dirty your hands by picking them up. And so this was the beginning of fine stylized cutlery and serviceware. These are just some of my oyster forks in my collection. They were stylized to mimic Neptune's trident with the 3 tines, and they could be elaborate or plain, but an oyster would never be served without an appropriate utensil or in an appropriate plate. And there were these 3 specific styles: the geometric, which was the perfect circle of 6 molds around the center for the sauce, the kidney plate or crescent shaped, and the turkey plate, which has only 5 mold versus 6 for the geometric. The turkey plate is interesting as being one of the most collectible because of our President Rutherford B. Hayes, who had one brought into the White House. And you can kind of see the turkey shape behind it. Those brown closed oysters was a raccoon oyster, which is now extinct. And the open oysters were blue points. So I'm going to stop there and see if we have questions. I do have more slides, but.
Carrie, I'm going to suggest we're fine. Why don't you go a little further?
Okay. So I'll skip through some of the plates and just kind of show you that they can be astronomically expensive. I own 3 or 4, and I think I spent $10 on them. But I will talk briefly about the future of oysters and what we're getting into with this what's known as a triploid is a relatively new invention. Sorry, it's beginning to hail here, excuse me. When you think of crossing a donkey with a zebra, and you get an animal that can't be reproduced again, that's very similar to what a triploid is. They construct it by using 2 sets of chromosomes from the egg and 1 from the sperm. The resulting triploid has 3 sets of chromosomes in total, making it reproductively sterile. By manipulating and controlling these basic reproductive functions, the scientists are creating an oyster that has no spawning season. Proponents believe that there's very little difference in the flavor, and that the public at large have no idea that they are eating a quote unquote genetically modified oyster. In 2009, more than 8 billion triploid oyster larvae were hatched. So this is a huge thing in the industry. People like bigger, juicier, fatter oysters, and triploids are kind of what's the way of the world. The other oyster of concern is what is known as banded oysters or pre-shucked oysters. And these are irradiated, and this is a process known as HPP or high pressure processing. Advocates state that the process destroys potentially deadly pathogens like Vibrio, which can cause gastronomic distress. People that have autoimmune disease or liver disease, this is great for them because, but to me, it's dead. It's and when you eat an oyster and you get a freshly shucked oyster, it's ostensibly still alive. And the reason that they have to put the rubber band around the oyster is because it's dead. Reading some of the oyster boards that I'm on, when you go to a really large festival where 40,000 oysters might be served, they're going to be serving these. Banded oysters or quote unquote pre-shucked oysters are huge in the casino industry, pre-COVID days, the cruise ships, any place that high volume of oysters need to be prepared and served on a daily basis. As the irradiation kills the microbe, it kills the living oyster and it shortens its shelf life. So I'm not necessarily a fan of these, but I do know people that I really enjoy them. And I think I've tasted them and there's just something about it. They taste dead. I will segue lastly, second to last, into what is my favorite website. And this is called Oyster Raider. And it is sort of a collective that you can join that lists all of the known oysters that are available with links to where they're farmed, what their genus is. You can search by location, and it's sort of growing exponentially as new people are adding more oysters. And I just learned in preparing my slides, I didn't know that there are now some European flats that are being grown in Tomales Bay. So I'm very excited about that possibility. Lastly, Mary Ellen introduced me as an artist, and I'll show you some of my work, some paintings that I did for an exhibition this last year where I painted the ingredient of a recipe from a 1909 cookbook, and I added a utensil to the painting. And I did more than just oysters, but they were the most fun for me to paint. So we can leave that picture up, or we can go back to my favorite oyster website. And I'm happy to now look and see what questions are in the chat.
Carrie, I want to buy them. I want both pieces. They're not for sale, I'm assuming, right?
I have to say, you know, they might be gone. I'll have to check. So,
So Carrie, we actually are going to, if it's all right, have you stop sharing your screen while we add,
hey,
if that's okay, so they can see you when we're doing this
how's that?
and see them. And again, we have a few questions in the chat. Carrie, thank you so much. As you know, I'm a oyster aficionado. There was so much here that I didn't know. And now I also know why we connected. Marcia, I'll call on you just a second. Why we connected so quickly, because I also collect oyster plates and oyster forks. So you show me your collection and I'll show you mine. I am going to go with a couple of questions first in the chat, and then we'll have Marcia. Once somebody asked Bill, will you explain the difference between oysters and clams?
It's a different genus. They're different animals, just like a mussel. So yeah, they're just different. They don't crossbreed. They're not the same. They're not the same thing.
Great. And is there a new tool that is being used now to shuck oysters, or is the shucker still the tool used? That is,
you know, there are tons, and in the book, I have a picture of a Victorian tool that was invented. There's always people who are inventing new ways to shuck oysters. And I saw a video just this afternoon of one where the oyster's put up on the side in a little frame, and you pull down a little hammer sort of to pry it open. Some of them are harder to get open. So I think I'm an old school. I use the knife.
And someone had their hand up, and I don't see the hand up now. So do you want to?
Oh, it was me, Mary Ellen.
Oh, thank you, Marcia. Thank you. My apologies. So ask your question.
Oh, I don't have a question. I wanted to show you. Could you see this picture?
Kinda.
So that is a 4-inch.
Oh.
And this is kind of the whole group of them. Super humongous, literally 4 inches, that I had in Lyon, France. A couple of years ago, I went to visit my son, and right by the Rhone River on Saturday mornings, you go there and they have an open air, you know, to get cheeses and whatnot. You sit down at a table and they literally take it out of the Rhone River, shuck it for you, and sit you on a table. And normally I don't eat raw oysters, but my 3-year-old grandchild was sucking them down like lollipops, and I was so embarrassed that I had to try it.
You know, in general, warmer waters are going to give you bigger oysters. So if you go to New Orleans or the Gulf, I used to live in Southern California, and I wish I had pulled them out, so I should have had them here. You know, again, there's oysters that are 8 inches long. Those are too big for me to eat raw. They're just.
I've had them in New Orleans, and these were huge. These were much bigger, but they were sweet, and they serve it with just lemon and bread.
Yeah, and it's part of what, you know, Olympian oysters, those ollies are, you know, kind of tiny and sweet. And one of the new things that's happening in the oyster industry scientifically, and I learned this through the discovery of the cushy oyster, is they're now taking them out when they're like 6 months old or every 3 months and tumbling them. And what that does is it breaks off the outer shell and forces the bowl to become bigger, so that it makes a bigger oyster, as opposed to the European flat that is a larger, flatter shell. Again, maybe because I am here on the West Coast, I'm sort of obsessed with the European oyster because they're so hard to find. And part of it is last year was the pandemic. The year before that, I was presenting at the Oxford Food Symposium, and I was so thrilled in Oxford walking down. There was a sign out that said, you know, Colchesters. And I'm like, I'm finally going to get to taste a Colchester. Well, they brought them out and they were the Pacific oyster. They were not the Colchester flats that I was expecting. And there are so many sort of diseases and things that are wiping out oyster beds around the world, like the Portuguese's, that it's the Pacific oyster, that genus, which is hardier, that they're able to reseed in some of these existing estuaries. So Colchester is now growing Pacific oysters. And it was just heartbreaking to me. And I'm, you know, talking to the manager saying, no, these aren't Colchesters. These aren't Colchesters. And they assured me, they actually even called them. And I was talking to the farmers saying, yep, these are what is growing in Colchester now, our Pacific oysters. But they taste different. They're just.
So Carrie, I'm upset because I should have pulled them. I have about 20 Colchester medieval festival and oyster fair menus and stuff from 60s on. And also, if anybody has an opportunity, I don't know if you've been able to be to Colchester for the festival, but they are trying to hold it this year, July 31st to August 1st. And my intention was always to go to Oxford Food Symposium and then to stay on for Colchester. So I thought I might.
That's a great idea.
Where is that?
So where is Colchester in terms of where where is it in relationship, say, to London?
A little northeast.
Right.
So Kobe's raising her hand.
Okay, Kobe, go.
Carrie, I just loved your presentation. It's so informative. But I have a comment. You showed a picture of a ship with a Dutch flag sailing into New York Bay.
Wrong picture?
I think that is Cape Town Bay with the Table Mountain and Lion Head.
I'll make a note of that. Thank you. I think I found that one this afternoon as I was frantically trying, to find pictures of what would be the 1600s. But I felt lucky that I found one with a Dutch flag. So thank you.
And we do have a couple of more questions, and then we're going to go to Larry. So Elaine wanted to know, what is your favorite way to eat oysters?
Raw, nothing. I will always taste an oyster first, and then decide if it needs maybe a little lemon, maybe a little mignonette. And mignonette is red wine vinegar with chopped shallot. Even then, when I put mignonette in, the most I'll do is dip the tines of my fork in the mignonette and touch the oyster. I don't want that much flavoring. Tabasco sauce, never. I'm just tasting Tabasco sauce.
Right. So one gulp.
No.
Bite.
So what my Aunt Lola taught me was to put it in your mouth and chew a little bit to let the flavor expand in your mouth and let some of the juices start to go down the back of your throat, but never just to swallow whole. You need to chew it open a little bit and taste the earthiness. And you're going to get notes like copper, you might get cucumber, you might get citrus. And as wine has terroir, oysters have merroir.
And then one more question before Larry. Kathleen, this is actually a comment. She said, when I moved to Sacramento 2 years ago from Cape Cod, I ate an oyster taco and there was a small pearl in it. It almost broke a tooth. How common is that?
So I'm wearing a big pearl. I love my pearls. Pearl oysters are a different genus, and they are not the same oyster. So if you found a pearl in what's known as a true oyster or an edible oyster, it would have been mostly made of calcite. So it's the PT pterid. See, my Greek is horrible. But the oysters that make pearls have very, very little meat in them. They're practically inedible. And it's the lining of the oyster shells that create this beautiful nacre that would create a pearl. So yeah, occasionally you might find an oyster in a true oyster. Excuse me, you would find a pearl in a true oyster, but it would have been mostly calcite, not a shimmery nacre.
Good. Larry, you have a question, then I have one of my own. Unmute yourself. Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Okay. I had two comments. One was that Mary Ellen and I have eaten oysters all over the world together. And we also went to the Oxford Food Conference together too, which we had a wonderful time at. So I don't know if that was the one you were at. Was it 2 years ago that we went there?
Yeah, 2 years ago we were in person.
Yeah, so I thought that was right. But anyway, so it's really a wonderful talk that you did. So I really think that starting with your aunt was the best deal.
Great. And Carrie, I just have a question, and I know that you said you weren't talking about the United States much, but do you know the story at all of Jack London's time as an oyster pirate in California?
I remember reading about it, but I do not remember the whole story. So please feel free to.
Oh, okay, and I won't go into detail here, but it's one of the most delightful stories that Jack London ever tells, because he did both parts. He was both an oyster pirate, where he would literally steal the oysters, and then he turned that around and became got a job as I think it was the California Fish Patrol. So I'm just going to suggest that people check up on that a little bit more. And I will say that I wanted to give a couple of places. I'm going to ask you of where your favorite places to eat oysters. Locally, we were really known for oysters in Sacramento. Up until COVID-19, one of the best places to go was Station 16. The young man that was shucking there in 8 months became the fastest shucker in California.
Wow.
But they still do really fresh oysters. Where's your favorite place to eat them, where the ambience, the oysters, everything is right?
Pre-COVID, unquestionably Swan Oyster Bar in San Francisco.
Yes. Can we meet up there? And also the oyster bar that's in the Castro. Do you remember the name of that one?
I do.
Larry and I went there with Elaine Corn.
I have been there. Again, I mean, and I don't even know if it's still there, because so many places have closed.
So many places. And I'm really going to recommend for people, if you have not been to Swan's Oyster Bar, if they ever open up again, they're only open Monday through Friday, like what, 8 to 5. The line is out.
They close it. They think they close at 4. It's like
I think they close at 4.
I will mention Hog Island, because they are huge. That's probably one of our bigger California oyster companies, and they are known for their hogwash, which is their version of a mignonette. And pardon me, I can't stand it. It's cilantro based. So I do, they're famous for their hogwash. But I will tell you that when I got married 9 years ago, we had an oyster shucker at our reception. And so I have a very, very supportive husband, but there's so many different oyster anecdotes and stories that can be told throughout history, the oyster wars. And again, we could just narrow it down to just oysters in America, but I said, I'm a bit of an Anglophile, and the fact that there's oyster beds written in the Domesday Book just thrilled me to no end.
And I will apologize. Earlier I said I did a mafia wedding. It was 400 dozen oysters. A story we'll tell later. I have one question, then I'm going to go to Linda Hacks. I went to an oyster, what I thought was going to be an oyster festival in the Chesapeake Bay this was some years back, I want to think 15 years. And at that point, the oyster beds were literally dying in the Chesapeake Bay. Is that is that true elsewhere? Do you know if they've been able to replenish? Certainly New York is starting to replenish their saddle rocks.
New York is trying to replenish, and many places are. I don't know specifically about Chesapeake, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Mhm.
There's another great story where the Olympian beds up in the Pacific Northwest were dying, and it's a great World War II story where one of the first planes that was chartered out of Japan when World War II was ended was arranged by General MacArthur, and it was of oyster spat from Japan, because the oyster beds were dying in the Pacific Northwest and they needed to replant those beds. So it's, I think with global warming, I think we're going to be seeing it considerably, throughout the world in different locations, but I haven't been keeping track of specific locations and how they're working on. I know Mark Twain wrote about the oysters that he had in San Francisco, out of the San Francisco Bay. And I think there was a small group that was working on getting those restarted as well.
So Linda Hacks asked a question, and you might not be able to answer this, so I'll say just in California, any local places for an oyster sandwich? And if not, I might mention an oyster loaf.
Please do, because I don't eat them fried very often.
And we'll ask the oyster loaf was literally a Pullman bread, which is a square bread that was done on the trains. It would be hollowed out and they would put oysters inside. And we did have for a very short time a restaurant in Sacramento that attempted to do that, and that was the Saddle Rock. They ended up closing business pretty quickly. But I do have, I was the person who actually gave them the original recipe from the Saddle Rock restaurant from about 1872. So if anybody would like to know how to make an oyster loaf, I will gladly send the recipe.
Send it to me.
Oh, good. We'll do that. So are there any other questions before we ask? What we like to do is to ask Carrie to just kind of do a close, and then we'll stop the recording. But some people are a little shy. We just ask you to stay 5 minutes more for kind of green room debrief. So anything you'd like to say for closing remarks, Carrie?
Well, I thank you all so much for the kind comments. I think I fretted about this all week because I kept adding more slides and more things I wanted to talk about. I didn't touch upon oyster sauce in China, or
I'd like you to come. I was going to actually ask, because you didn't touch on things like oyster sauce or the Japanese, I would love for you to come back and do part 2. I know that sounds strange. Or in addition, lobster. So that's my closing question to you. Both of those were foods that were for, quote, poor people. Convict ate them. When did they go from what is it, cuisine primera for the poor people to a luxury dish?
Oysters, I think, were always both. And one of the slides that I took out is, if you see the modern Chinese oyster pail for Chinese food, the story was that the company that made them made too many, and that they were initially used in the oyster industry at the turn of the century, because John Q. Public would not want to go home and shuck the oysters. So they would pre-shuck them and give them in a little white pail. Then with the advent of some of the diseases, and I didn't talk about cholera, which was a big oyster-borne disease that ravaged both the United States and Europe, that the company that made the oyster pails had this surplus, ended up selling them to Chinese restaurants. So what we now know as the Chinese oyster restaurant pail came from the oyster industry.
Good. And again, I want to thank you so much. Make sure that I don't want to close up before saving the chat, or if somebody else will make sure they save the chat before I stop the recording so that you can get a copy of it as well. And if you can just speak one more time so people can see your oyster blouse, then I will.
Oh, so my sister, I'll kind of stand up. My sister made me this that has oysters on the half shell. And when I give my oyster presentations, I wear my oyster kimono garb.
Great. So again, thank you very much. And this recording will be on YouTube and a link sent to you tomorrow.